just a minute. Let me get back to this. Okay.
There you go. There.
Okay, we've been through this, and so it's a Nara era garden. There aren't any gardens left in Japan. Is this okay now?
It's perfect.
Perfect.
Okay. So this, as we walked into this garden, there were maybe 2 other people in the garden. The taxi driver waited for us because he was sure there was nothing there. This was 2008. This garden opened in 1998, so it was very new. And this is what they found. I mean, this is a model of what they found. You can see a stream along here. I'm guessing that these dowel type structures are where the palaces and buildings, pavilions were. And you can see the outlines of a pond here. And they think the garden was built in 2 parts and that there was a stream first, earlier. And this is where part of the stream is. And you can see it's a very rocky garden. They could still see the outlines of some of the streams. They think that, and the book doesn't say exactly that this was the garden made by Empress Suiko, who lived from 592 to, or reigned from 592 to 628. Maybe that was her life. And both she and her regent, who was the one who adopted Buddhism and really promoted it in Japan, built gardens. And but this is the right era for that. The only thing is that they say from poetry, they know that she had a mountain in her garden. And if this is that garden, they didn't reconstruct. But of course, from an archaeological dig, you wouldn't still have the mountain. They probably, when they buried the garden and the palace, to build something else there. And at the time of the Nara era, every time there was a new emperor or empress, they built a new palace because of the purity laws. So in 2008, the garden's been open 10 years. The plants are still pretty young. And it really reflects the style of the gardens, which had been in China, which had been reported back to Japan by an envoy sent from Japan to China in 607. And so he talked about the gardens in China, the pavilions and so forth, and probably oversaw some of the early gardens in Japan. So here's one of the buildings that was built. There weren't very many buildings. They didn't rebuild the palaces, but we can see some features here that relate to our garden. A convoluted shaped pond. It isn't just a round like a farm pond for the livestock to drink out of. The pebbled shores and the pond bottom, which they had commented on in poetry and literature, was often commented on and had been commented on from Chinese gardens. There were islands. There was a roofed exterior wall. The whole garden's walled in. And there were Chinese style pavilions and bridges. Now, it's not a stroll garden, so the court ladies would have been just walking from one pavilion, the palace, to the pavilion, over the bridges to enjoy the garden. And there was no mountain included in the reconstruction, but one is mentioned in poetry as being, and in the early books on gardening as having been in this empress or that empress's garden. Whether this is actually the garden from that empress or not, I don't know. And this garden has some borrowed scenery. I really thought we were completely out in the boondocks. We didn't see any buildings, houses, villages, but there's obviously a bowling alley behind this garden. It's sort of like the garden in Tokyo with the Tokyo Dome as its borrowed scenery. Okay, that's all that I have. So Susan, were you going to go next, or is Peggy?
I can go next.
Okay.
So, let me just do this. Okay, I'm going to try muting everybody, but it doesn't seem to work. Okay. Okay, so let me share the screen. And we're going to go to this one and view full screen. Okay, so the garden that I was going to talk about is the Japanese garden in California in Van Nuys. And this garden, I loved this garden because of the idea. And this is the aerial view. It was actually made in 1984. And the Los Angeles city engineer who was planning this sewage treatment plant thought it would be nice to have a Japanese garden next to it to kind of prove that the reclaimed water would be good even for the most delicate of gardens, which he considered Japanese gardens. And so this engineer hired a designer who designed a lot of gardens in this country, but he's from Japan, Dr. Kawana. So let's see. Here is our borrowed scenery. So the borrowed scenery in this garden is the sewage treatment plant. And they used all this water that's in the pond and everything had come out of the sewer and had been treated. And it has turned into a very beautiful garden. We also have a lot of the usual elements of other Japanese gardens. Here we can see the pebbled shore. It's not quite pebbled, but it's got a lot of shoreline. And of course, water is by far the main feature of this garden. Here we have the black pine tree. And here's several different kind of lanterns. They have a rather elaborate Kasuga lantern. This is a very large one at the front. And then I can never say this one, Yokimodoro. And it's standing on the water. You can see the really pretty plantings all along here. And this is one that I hadn't actually been familiar with. It's called the Nurasagi, which means the wet heron lantern. And we saw these a couple times in the gardens in Japan. They have water lilies, and they also have some real lotuses, although they weren't blooming when I was there. And I just love this view of the heron. We're looking down across the length of the pond. And you can see the typical pruning of all of the azaleas to look like mounds. They have a little stream flowing through. And they have a nice tea house right on the edge of the water that you can go to the balcony of the tea house, and then I think they have tea ceremonies in the inside. And there was one thing I noticed in this garden that I liked were the paths. And this is actually from Mark Keene's book. I was trying to remember the names of these when I was with Kara at this garden. But there's three kinds of designs. There's shin, which is man-made and man-made materials, and solid geometrical. There's so, which is natural design, natural materials. And then there's, I think you would say this gayo. Anyway, it's a combination. And so these are the various different patterns. So here you can have, these are the shin design and shin materials, but this is the shin design with natural rock materials. These are combination design. And these are just, this is the so design with the so materials. So you can mix and match them. And this one I would call a mixed, because we still have the straight edges and the cement, which is man-made, but we have the natural stones. And I thought it was just really quite pretty. And here, this was one of their entrance threshold stones as you walked into the garden there. So that's my final picture of this garden with a lot of Japanese features, and this was just a desert next to a sewage plant, and look what they made out of it. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'm going to unmute everybody, and back to Jane, I guess. Who's going to go next, Jane?
Peggy, do you want to go next?
Sure, I can go next. Okay. There. And we'll start. So I wanted to take you to a kind of local garden that is in Oregon, and it's in Lebanon, Oregon, which is sort of a, we hadn't heard a lot about Lebanon, but we've learned a lot since. So Lebanon is south of Portland. If you go past Salem and Albany, you get down about level with Corvallis. And if you go west on Highway 20 east on Highway 20, you get to Lebanon. Corvallis is straight west on the same highway. So that's where it's located. And in 2000, this was just a little farming community, and it had a hospital, which actually you can see right here. And it was, the hospital was kind of having a hard time, and the community was getting smaller and dwindling. And so the civic leaders got together to make a decision on what to do, and they worked together with a Japanese garden landscape designer who came from, well, he was trained in Japan, but he was at Portland Japanese Garden, where he actually, I think, designed or was largely responsible for building that wonderful big waterfall into the pond that used to be the zoo's bear pit. But anyway, his name is Hoichi Kurisu, and together with the community, they built this hospital, and it just ended up transforming the whole community, not just the hospital itself. So this is a close-up of the hospital, and you can see the Japanese garden in the central courtyard of it. This is built intentionally to be a healing garden. And the Kurisu International, who built the garden, incorporated ancient philosophies of Japanese garden design to reconnect people with nature, because they have found that research showed that exposure to nature can significantly reduce physical evidence of relaxation with positive changes in blood pressure.
Yeah, there was a mute symbol here.
Okay. Thank you.
That's okay. And it lowers blood pressure, heart activity, reduces muscle tension, and increases brain activity, so that this relaxation of the body can be an enhancement to the healing process. Steve and I first met Hoichi here in the center when we went to a NAJGA conference. NAJGA is North American Japanese Garden Association, and the conference was in Chicago, and his healing gardens were a feature of that particular conference. Then 4 years later, the conference was actually in Portland, and they came to this garden. This is a garden in the Lebanon Community Hospital, and I'm losing my place in my notes here. Oh, and so that anyway, I really wanted to say that the pictures that I'm going to show you are from both the 2014 and 2018 when we visited this garden. So when you enter, the garden serves 4 hospital populations. Students look out on this garden from their classrooms, and then the public part of the garden is viewable from the cafeteria and also from a main corridor of the hospital. And then one wing has the birthing section of the hospital where the expectant mothers going through labor can look out on the garden. And there's one other which we'll come to a little bit later. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the garden. So when you walk into the garden, you can cross this little bridge, and there are 2 gazebos in the garden, and both of them are authentic Japanese construction. And then beside the garden, you have these little earth and timber steps that go up to a small mountain area where you pass the waterfall, which never really has a strong view from the paths of the garden. But there are many paths that walk around and just a little tiny area and have benches here and there so that patients and visitors can stroll and sit and just pause and meditate. The pond is at one end of the garden, and this is the 4th population that the garden serves. You see these windows on the right-hand side, and there's koi in the pond, and the waterfall is over here to the right. This is where the patients who are receiving infusion therapy and have to sit for hours all day long get to look out on the garden.
Oh, that's nice.
That's lovely. Yeah, we can go by there and see it when we go to Ashland ever.
Yeah, you can stop by. It's just a short way off I-5.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Excuse me, talking makes my scratchy allergies come to
They're nice pots, especially
All right.
that one. Wish we had some like that
Yeah.
place.
So this garden became so famous that it really helped the whole city rebuild. And then in 2014, they enlarged this. They decided to build a large complex across the street. So this is the hospital with its garden, and across the street they built a whole complex which houses the Western University of Health Sciences has buildings down here. It's a Pacific Northwest campus.
Nice.
And then there's a Best Western Hotel and the garden. And then here's a small convention hall where you can have large group meetings, and this wonderful huge plaza that can have outdoor events. The garden itself has the central pond, and the paths has 2 gazebos and a waterfall. So this actually shows this a little bit better. There's also in the hotel, there's a nice dining area that overlooks the garden, and it's really a nice place to have a lunch and watch the garden.
Field trip.
When you enter the whole complex, you go by this wonderful rock waterfall garden that you can see from the street, but you can also, there are paths you can walk up on top of it. And it's really quite lovely. So when we first saw this garden in 2014, excuse me, it was under construction, and you can see the hotel is still just being framed. It's really, really new. The pond's complete, but the plantings are in, and you can see here the rocky shore. This is looking from the same spot to the right. You can see the plaza and the convention hall. And this is the mountain area where the waterfall and the paths are. So 4 years later, when we returned, and this was actually a part of a tour from the NOD conference that was in Portland, it looked like this. So the plantings are beginning to grow and look much more filled in, and the hotel was open for business. When you look across the pond, you can see the plaza and the convention hall. Has a nice fence. From the convention hall looking out across the plaza, you can see that fence and get a panoramic view of the whole garden. So, and one little feature I saw of interest on inside the gazebo, they had a koi food dispenser. So you didn't have to have all those work parties. Fill the little cup and you get a handful of koi food. And they had the really beautiful koi with lots of babies. So they're going to have a very full pond.
Oh,
Near the fence, you can start to see the detail, excuse me, inside the garden, which you can see a little better here. You can see the waterfall. There's a little gazebo inside the garden, a bridge here. And then as you enter the garden through this small gate at the corner of the courtyard. And as you walk through the garden, you can see its various elements from different vantage points. But what's common to this garden is the background. They borrowed scenery is the hotel. And in other angles is the convention center. So that's all you get for borrowed scenery. This is the lower waterfall and stream that goes down into the larger pond. You can see some pines. And this is from the mountain area that goes up from the gazebo. You wander up the paths. And here's the main waterfall.
main waterfall, yeah.
That creates the stream that goes down
So
into
verdant.
the pond.
Mhm.
And the paths wander around in the mountain area and have little alcoves like this with benches for seating and just sitting. And then you come down the mountain on the other side, and here's that rocky shore again. You come back to the hotel, and from this balcony over here, you can get this wonderful panoramic view of the whole garden. So it's really quite lovely. And this whole thing is designed by Hoichi Kurisu, who just has this amazing philosophy on healing gardens. And he also designed Anderson Garden in Chicago, near Chicago. And he did a healing garden at a teen drug recovery facility called Rosecrans. So I just wanted to bring this garden to all of your attention because, Stephen, I thought it was just lovely.
It is.
Any questions?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Dewey, are you ready to?
Try sharing my screen. Yes, I'm ready. And if people wish to keep their mics on and ask questions, I'm more of an interactive person. If we can not all jumble up, if you see something right away, don't want to hold till later, please speak up. We can talk about it. Let's see what happens when I go to share screen, PowerPoint. Nothing. Slideshow. And we're just slides into it. I'm talking about going back in time, back in geography now compared to where we've just been. This is a late 1700s garden in Okinawa called, it's not Japanese, it's a Ryukyuan royal garden in Shuri, Naha, Okinawa. And the entry stone at the parking lot announces how it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, as well as a National Site of Scenic Beauty since the 1990s. And its translation, character by character, is knowledge, know, garden. Oh, where is the Ryukyuan kingdom, or used to be, the Ryukyu Islands and Okinawa? A little geography lesson. Of course, we start with Tokyo up here on the main island of Honshu, travel across Shikoku down through Kyushu, and we go down this long, about 650-mile chain of islands right offshore of Taiwan. And that's the farthest extent that Japan goes, to the south and west. In the 1500s or so, a bunch of the people on these islands got together and formed a kingdom. I don't know the history that well. And they located on the largest island of Okinawa. And it became a major entity in that era, as I like to think of it, as the Trans-East Asian Sea Treaty that was controlled by China. And if you wish to participate in trade with China, you had to have a authorization, and envoys with China would visit you and give you the certificate to be a participant in this large trading pact amongst the countries. So every once in a while, they would come to Okinawa whenever a new king was crowned, and they would form this pact of agreement or continue the agreement to participate in the trade. As now, anybody know what the southernmost prefecture here is, which is the one that adjoins Okinawa now? Anybody remember the movie I Wish? Kagoshima? And at that time, it was the feudal fiefdom of the Satsuma clan. And for a long time, China was the main influence. But as we get up into when the Edo period starts in the 1600s, Satsuma is one of the outcasts, and they become almost an independent country. They became part of this trading agreement. Finally, with the Meiji Restoration and the establishment of the prefectures, I think the line is right about in here now. So Kagoshima to the north, and the new prefecture of Okinawa is here. And the name Ryukyu just sort of disappeared into the geography books of the Ryukyu Islands. At that time, the castle town of Shuri was about in here. It was a small town and very small port of Naha over here. The rest of it was all agriculture. But as you can see, things change over time. Shuri soon became a suburb of Naha. So you hear a lot about Naha, but very little about the palace at Shuri, unless you happen to keep a close eye on news and the disastrous fire in October that burned down the palace. In late 1700s, down here in the little town of Hamaji, a suburb, rural town, they created a villa for the imperial family, and late 1700s attached a garden, Shikinaen. It was fairly large at one point, but as you can see, it's gotten circumscribed. They even built a freeway through it, or an expensive tollway through it. And the garden itself, still the core of the garden, is right here. And it's no longer an agricultural spot, as you can see. It's very influenced by China. Therefore, the map has got south up. As in Taoist concept of garden design, south is the most important direction. The villa was here, so they added the garden to the south side of it so that it would look out to the garden. Entry gate over here, they did have a emperor's gate, but in this case it was a king's gate plus a servant's gate. Royalty and of course the Chinese envoys could come in this gate, and everybody else would go in this one. It was laid out with a winding path, just like we have for hide and reveal, and also to keep those pesky evil spirits at bay. And you would get to the villa. And then they have a stroll garden. This is 1799. What was going on then? George Washington died that year, 200 years into the Edo period. So the idea of feudal lord stroll gardens was well established now in the Edo period. So it continued along those lines in establishing one here. They had, this is their royal gate, and I consider it an architectural mashup. You can see this is a real Chinese roof with the tiles and the bracketing supports over the gate, but a very unusual use of stone for China, but not for Okinawa. It's cut limestone, sometimes very geometric, but also sometimes very intricately cut to fit into each other in a more random pattern. Soon upon entering, you go by the guardhouse, yet another architectural mashup with this very Chinese roof over a very island style architecture of Okinawa. The winding path takes you down through a heavily forested area to a spring, the Ray's Benevolence Spring, which had a place where you could dip water out of, as well as it goes off to feed the pond. Finally, you break out of the winding path into an open area, and you are revealed the villa, the main villa, in its entry pavilion. This was built in 1760s, I believe, and the garden was added in 1799 because they were expecting in 1800 one of these royal visits from, well, I guess you'd say imperial visit from China to bestow upon the new king the certificate to be part of the trading pact. The view that I'll show you is from across the pond, but I want to include a detail here. This, if you go to China, which of course these original models did come from, as Jane was telling us about, this would be a round wooden column on a round or oval stone, very carefully symmetrical and all of that. Well, by now in Japan and in Ryukyu Kingdom, they were getting away from that. And here we have this rather naturalistic foot to the column on this stone set in the surrounding to the building. Here is the main part of the building. Starts with an entry here and goes from a reception room down a corridor to the official rooms at the end. The reception room, pleasantly small spot, almost like a waiting area for the tea and in a tea ceremony setting. And when invited to do so, you would walk down this corridor. It too has some peekaboo views of the garden, like the reception room did. And on the other side of the corridor, as you're going by, is this internal garden, Tsuboniwa they're called. Here we have a ability to look a little closer at the end tiles used. A very Chinese thing to do is an end tile with a specific theme. I could find nothing other than they look floral to me as to what plant they might be representing. Anybody any guesses out there what this might be? It doesn't look like lotus or peony or anything that I'm familiar with. It almost looks like more like a lion's head, doesn't it? So anyhow, couldn't figure that one out.
Hibiscus?
Hibiscus? Could be. Mm-hmm. Now, typical Japanese architecture, as well as Ryukyuan, is to have removable walls. So these three rooms, 1, 2, 3, in this shot, are all opened up to make one large space. And it has a primary view out across the south end of the garden to this pavilion over on the other side. Looking a little further to this, towards the south, you'll see the rest of the garden, the south end of the garden, with these bridges, island bridges. Yeah. Look familiar? Earthen bridge, middle island, plank bridge, crossing your pond. Yeah, we all have the same influences, don't we? Here they are again from a different angle, showing this very rugged limestone pieced together and very naturalistic. I guess, as Susan was saying, this would be the so. And over here we have the shin, a limestone cut into very regular shapes. In Taoist thinking, we would call it yin and yin here and yang there. Across these bridges, coming over around here, yet another bridge. Mm-hmm. This one curiously cut from one single boulder. Of course, by the time you get it cut, you no longer see the boulder. And over to this pavilion, the hexagonal hall. I'm kind of surprised it didn't have a more flowery name, as most things in Chinese gardens do. Yeah, it's okay, it's a hexagon, but guys, can't we think of something a little more flowery? But there it is. Very curious mashup of this very heavy Chinese roof on a rather delicate looking surround here, trying to blend a little bit of that island architecture into the Chinese. Further down, I got this wrong on the, I'm so used to north being up from my architectural training. This is the south end of the garden. It's not the north end. We've just left the north end. It opens up into kind of a wider area, and our circuit goes all the way around here, making at one point a rather sharp turn in the path as it goes around this sharp turn in the pond. This, I believe, is one of the cycas revolota. We call them sago palms, but that's a misnomer. It's not a palm. And it's very native to the Ryukyus and probably Kagoshima, that far south. As you see a lot of them in these gardens in southern Japan. At the very far end is a boat basin with landing and steps down. And with the arched bridges that we saw, probably boating on this pond was a feature of its activity when it was used to entertain royal guests. And the outlet. And then this reveals that it's a dammed pond on top of a hill and a nice waterfall at the release going over the dam down and then downstream into the town. Continuing our way, we get to the far southern end, looking over from this gazebo called Observe Cultivation Platform. And that was because one of the main reasons they cited this garden here is an area where very few places in Okinawa you cannot see the ocean from an elevated location like this. It was a cultivation, not a scene of suburbs. It was rice and it was plant, vegetables. And they wanted to impress upon these Chinese envoys that it was a really substantial kingdom that had lots of resources and that China would be very happy to trade with them as they would be with China. Now the far end of the garden next to out of the pond becomes an arboretum. And I think that also harkens to some of the Taoist principles of Chinese garden design, where they did have arboretums and medicinal plants and vegetable growing going on in their Taoist gardens. Particularly the medicinal parts, as they were constantly trying to come up with the elixir of longevity from various potents that they would, and teas that they would make from all sorts of things. But here it's just basically a nice arboretum complete with signs that if you read the various languages, you have the Japanese pronunciation of the Japanese sound. In katakana over here, we have the Chinese characters and the names. This is the Ryukyuin or Luchu pine. It's an interesting one, and it's 5 to 7 inch long needles that come in bundles. I also have the fukugi in Japanese, which could be written with the characters fuku and tree, meaning happiness or lucky tree. And in as much as I can see, the common name is that. People call it either in Japanese the fukugi or in English the lucky tree. It apparently has a wonderful display of yellow flowers in the spring, but I was there in the summer, so we missed the show. But it has this nice foliage to be observed in the summer. The pink trumpet tree or vine, this was the tree, comes in different shapes and sizes. So there's some arguing over who really should be called the trumpet tree. But down there, they do call it the pink trumpet. And again, we missed the show on this tree of pink flowering. We did go around the bend, and the lantana camara here, it did have still flowers out, a very fragrant plant found throughout the world. Actually, there's 150 different species of it. Very popular in the tropical zones. The Caribbean has a lot, Central America has a lot, and then the Ryukyus also have various lantana. And of course, some of the standards you would expect to find in the South: banana, and bamboo, and the Cycas revoluta, as I talked about before, the sago palm. We're trying those over at the Chinese Garden in West Seattle, and they don't do well in our cold weather. We have learned that. They don't get this size for sure. And then, anybody got a guess? Nice plant, but there was no sign, and I don't know tropical plants, but it looks tropical.
It looks like a fern.
Mhm.
Fern. Ah,
Yeah,
that would
I
really
agree.
confuse me, coming up out of the ground like that.
Mhm.
Could be a fern. And then this wonderful variegated leaf product that had no sign to help me figure out what it was, nor could I find a leaf search that did so. But lots of different wonderful plants in the south of Japan, both in Kagoshima and now the very south, Okinawa. And I think the last one that I took a picture of is this kind of a trumpet flower in its own right, or a little lily of some sort.
Mhm.
So there were some summer flowers coming in. There is also autumn foliage. So they're into the 3-season foliage like Chinese and Japanese gardens. And I suspect there must be things in the winter there as well, because it does not get cold down in Naha. But it does stay nice all year round. So what else you can do is obviously go to the beach. Okinawa was quite interesting. Any questions? Take them in the Q&A area.
I have one more garden I could present if we have a few minutes. It won't take me more than 5. Let me go, and then are there questions from anybody? I was going to talk just very briefly about.
I have a quick question for Peggy.
Okay, go
Yeah.
ahead while I try to get this up. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
just setting up. Peggy, it's a quick question. What's the name of the hotel, that you showed next to your garden?
Oh, I think one of the maps actually shows me. Let me look that up and I'll email it to you.
Something,
Okay.
something
When the day comes where we can go stay in hotels again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it was a Best Western.
The Best Western is something, I'll come up with the
Yeah, you can
name
send
of it.
Yeah, that was, yeah. It's not often that you can just stay next to a Japanese garden.
Yeah. Oh, it's a beautiful view.
Yeah, and I like the healing aspect. That was really nice. Thank you for sharing.
Yes.
Am I on?
Yes.
See it?
Okay. When Susan decided to share gardens in Los Angeles, I decided, she said they had missed one in Pasadena because the traffic was so bad and they were trying to get out. So I decided that just because Los Angeles might be a reasonable destination, that I wanted to share just a little bit about the Huntington Gardens, which is near Pasadena, and is a lovely garden, but it's a place you really want to go and spend a whole day. And I think you can get, in fact, a multi-day pass. And it was built in 1911 by Henry Huntington, who was a railroad and real estate baron. And he utilized many things. There had been an earlier Japanese garden on a property near his, which I believe was a commercial nursery, and that had built a Japanese garden. So some of the things, not the moon bridge, that he had built for this particular space. The garden's sort of in a deep ravine, the Japanese garden. There's also a beautiful Chinese garden very close, on the same property. And the garden, the Japanese garden, is 9 acres, and it was open, the gardens were open to the public in 1928. So it's about twice as big as our garden. And there's a central koi pond and the moon bridge and quite a few tourists. There's a house that had been built in the early 20th century and sent to Pasadena for an expo in 1904. And I believe his neighbor had then purchased that house and had it moved to his property and Huntington had it moved to his after he bought out his neighbor's failed nursery business and land. Later, there was a tea house built up behind this with a tea garden, which I didn't have any pictures of from our more recent trip there. And from looking at their website, I learned that they are going to put another house on the property, a 300-year-old residence in Japan that has been lived in by 5 generations of the same family, has been donated to the Huntington Garden, and is at this time hasn't been lived in for several years apparently, is being dismantled and will be brought to the Huntington very soon. There's a dry garden, austere garden. It reminds me of the one over at the Blodell on Bainbridge, which is where they filled in a swimming pool. So it has this very rectangular edging with a wall on 3 sides of it and some plantings and a few rocks. There's also a bamboo grove, and this garden was renovated in 2011. During World War II, of course, it became, it was neglected. Let's just leave it at that. And so it has been renovated, and it's a lovely place. They have over 100 bonsai there. It's the home to a large bonsai organization. The house on the property, the mansion, and it's huge, is now an art museum. The rose garden was off the breakfast room where the Huntingtons sat and looked out over their property. There's a rose garden, a Chinese garden, an orchid house, a wonderful gift shop. Lots of books on Japanese gardens there. A fine library. I think it has a Gutenberg Bible. I just noticed on their website that the author Lisa C. has donated the papers of her family. She grew up in a home with like 400 Chinese relatives living right nearby in a complex. Which is sort of astonishing when you see her, because she's a tall, long-legged, Scandinavian-looking blonde, courtesy of her grandmother. Anyway, the Huntington is a wonderful place to visit. The Blue Boy is in the art museum there, and it's lovely and easy to get to. It's not actually in Pasadena; it's in San Marino, but right on the border of Pasadena.
We missed that one.
Okay.
I was there long ago.
It's, I don't know, Dewey, whether you were there before or after it was restored. Are there any questions or comments, or do some of you just want to name favorite gardens in Japan? And, Susan, thank you for hosting this. Let me tell you that we asked Susan to host it because she has a professional version, so she does not get cut off at 40 minutes, which are those of us who have the free version, that can happen to us. And I didn't want that to happen, say 15, 20 minutes ago. So we do have time if anybody would like to ask a question or say something, or volunteer. If we are in lockdown for longer and the garden isn't open, would you all be interested in doing this again?
Yes.
Yes.
Would any of you be willing to share gardens?
So I think, I think Peggy and I also, if people want to go on longer, of course, it's sort of a little show and tell, but we each have another garden.
Okay. Oh, I didn't know that.
I don't have mine ready for a slideshow though.
Oh, well, I could show, I just had one more if y'all want.
Okay.
Okay.
Fine with me. Anybody who needs to leave, we aren't going to be insulted if you push your leave button down at the right corner. And if you have questions while she's getting that, does anybody have a question?
I'm just sharing the screen here.
Oh, Susan.
Yeah.
So where is Van Nuys, California?
It's over in the San Bernardino Valley. It's towards the west. Do you know where the Getty Museum is?
California.
It's about 10 miles north of the Getty.
The San Fernando Valley area then. Okay.
Yeah,
so
San Fernando Valley.
Valley girls come from.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I have a question. I
Okay.
was wondering what other gardens Susan and Kara found on your trip. Because I think you were going to visit more.
We did, well, we went to San Diego, Friendship Garden. We went to the Huntington, which Jane showed you. We went to this Japanese garden. And
That's
then we
really
went to San Francisco. And
dry.
we went to the Stanford Library, had an exhibit about
Yeah.
the history of Japanese gardens that we went to. And that pretty much was all the time we had. I wish we would have had time to go to that one that Peggy was telling us about on the way up through Oregon.
Yeah.
So I was going to show San Francisco, but when I read that the Dr. Kawana, who was the designer of this garden in California, had designed a lot of gardens in this country. He did the one in Missouri, in St. Louis, in the Missouri Botanical Garden. And I thought, well, that'd be kind of fun to see two different gardens in very different climates that the same designer did. So we happened to have been there last year. So I pulled up a few photographs of this garden. Oh, there we go. And this is huge. This garden is 14 acres. They are in the Midwest. They don't have any real estate constraints like a lot of the gardens on the West Coast do. So it was very large. And this one was designed and built in 1977. So it's quite a bit younger than our garden.
Is this the Missouri Garden? Excuse me, Susan.
Yes, it's called the Missouri Botanical Garden. It's actually a wonderful garden, and this is just a part of it. Kind of like the Huntington. It's got a lot of different gardens.
And is it St. Louis?
St. Louis, Missouri. So I'll just show you just some of the features. In a way, it was big, and you kind of like the spaciousness, but also it doesn't have that intimate feel that the smaller garden like our garden has. It's meticulous, it's extremely popular, and so they have to have wide trails. They have, here's just a lot of the same kind of features that we have. We see here the drum bridge. They have their lantern here. This is one of the dome ones, the heron, the wet heron lantern. And they interestingly had sort of dry, small dry gardens all over that were kind of filling in instead of one large one. They had one of these, a pagoda, just like our pagoda. This one was on the edge of the garden, so you see actually a neighborhood behind it. And we were there in the spring, so some of the azaleas were just really gorgeous and filled with flowers. You can see behind the pond. It's got a very large pond.
I wasn't quite sure what we were going to
Yeah, this one doesn't look quite as interesting or even as Japanese. Ooh, I couldn't do that.
Well,
It's an
it has a
interesting
lot
bridge,
of the
though.
features, but it's sort of larger, so it didn't. Yeah, I agree. It did have a pretty cool bridge with the irises and a nice bamboo fencing. They did have the pine tree.
Yeah, I can see it doesn't have.
Ooh,
Oh,
I like
that's nice. That's
That's
very nice. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
And they've got.
What's that? That's not what you call a. No, that's too big for the little miniature tree, huh?
No, but I
No.
think it's a Japanese black pine.
Fine, yeah.
Well,
But black
That's nice.
pines in general don't really much like Kansas and Missouri, particularly that part of Missouri, and also azaleas. The soil is not at all acidic there.
Well, I
So
think they have to work at it.
that's a very, yes.
Here's
Acidic
the
soil,
slope
yeah.
steps
A lot of
made out of
I had
natural
never-
steps.
been able to sign on to one of these things before. So this is the first time I had that kind of
Okay. This, and they had, I just liked it. They had a turtle island, but I was more intrigued with the actual turtles, just like their waterfall was there. A little bit, again, everything was sort of bigger. It was a bigger waterfall, and all just came pouring over. A nice little pebble beach. They got some nice pebbles there. And this was when actually we were all going to try to find a few features that were in all of our gardens. So you might have noticed that we all four of us have showed some pebble beaches and some background scenery and some of the kind of features. And this would be the borrowed scenery. It's the last photograph of the Japanese garden, but see, there's a lot of trees in the back. And as I said, this was a huge garden and there were a lot of different areas. So as you walk out of the Japanese garden, you shortly find yourself on the other side of the world. And I mean, sometimes the contrast really shows you what makes a Japanese garden different from a Victorian garden. Actually, I kind of liked them both, but in different ways. The tulips were gorgeous. Okay.
Do you know anybody in Everett?
Everett?
I don't think so.
Is there a
I
garden
can leave
there?
a message.
I had a question. There are two notable elements to Japanese garden that were not in the Ryukyuan garden. Did anybody notice something missing?
In which garden?
My garden,
Oh,
the
your
Ryukyu
garden?
in Okinawa.
I didn't. Did you show any stone lanterns?
Nope.
No,
I don't know if that's a necessary feature, but it's a common feature.
neither in the one I showed,
Not a one.
not a one.
One
And I
other-
don't know if it's because they couldn't reconstruct them from archaeology and couldn't be sure where they were, or if they just felt they weren't common in gardens at that time, if they came later.
I believe you that that's the case. If they had come from China, they would have been metal. They probably had not transformed into stone yet in those early
Okay.
gardens. Yeah, that would be my guess.
I was surprised not to see lotus in the Okinawa garden
Yes, it's not. I didn't see it there at all.
because they must grow there.
Very, very little water. There was no water lilies. There was some that reedy plant in the gardens, but there was not any floating flowers in the garden. Susan just mentioned one in her garden that we have in our garden, but surprisingly was not in this one to me because of its Taoist roots. No Turtle Island.
Oh, Turtle Island.
Yeah, I was quite surprised with that. But
Yeah, and most Japanese gardens that I've been to do have some form of a turtle island. Peggy, did the one in Lebanon have a turtle island?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
And I didn't remember seeing lanterns in the garden either. Did you, Steve? Steve, you're muted.
No, I don't remember lanterns.
Yeah. Susan, the last time I was in the garden in St. Louis, there were 5 wedding parties in the Japanese garden.